Good morning. It's a privilege to be here, and I thank PJ for this opportunity while he's away to fill the pulpit. And I want to say that it is Memorial Day weekend, as we've suggested, and it's a time to think about those who have fallen. And I want to actually take that concept and think about it in a spiritual way today as we get started. Now, with Memorial Day, there's a little bit of controversy as to when it exactly started, and there's some different stories and ideas because a lot of people had this concept in mind hundreds of years ago. But the most common story is that in 1866, a man by the name of Henry Wells in Waterloo, New York, decided that on May 5th, we should have all the shops in town closed down for the day and spend it honoring and thinking about the men and women who died during the Civil War. So, in Waterloo, New York, on May 5th, 1866, nearly 150 years ago, over 150 years ago, the town closed down, and it went well. Everybody appreciated the gesture, the time to think about the fallen. 2 years later, in fact, one of the generals from that town said, we should make this a declaration for anybody across the nation to be involved. And he put on the name, this is going to be Decoration Day. And we should encourage everybody to go to the grave sites of those who fell during the Civil War, and decorate the graves. So they did that, and the tradition began to take off. Now, as it continued, in 1882, the name of the holiday was changed from Decoration Day to Memorial Day, and it was changed from May 5th to May 30th. Now, after World War I, the holiday was changed to not just think of those who died during the Civil War, but all American wars. And then, just 51 years ago, in 1971, President Richard Nixon made Memorial Day a national holiday and was to be celebrated the last Monday in May. So here we are at that time this year. Now, I'd like to ask a question, and I'd actually like you to stand if this is true. Can I ask those who have had family or a close friend who gave their life for the sake of the country to please stand at this time? If you've had family or a close friend give their life for the sake of this country, can you stand? Thank you. We want to just take some time to honor those who did that. One of my great uncles, his name was Robert Clace, was serving in World War II. This would have been my grandmother's brother on my mom's side. And he actually ended up in Papua New Guinea, or around the islands to the east of it, during his time in World War II. And as he was there, he wrote letters back to his family in Nebraska. And Robert, what he wrote in the letters was not so much about the war going on, though he mentioned that. He actually mentioned the people groups that he saw there in the South Pacific around Papua New Guinea. And he talked about the villages, and the people that were living there were actually assisting them and helping them out during this war. And he said that one of the things that was burdened on his heart was after this whole war thing was done, that someone would go back to that area as a missionary to tell them about Jesus. And I remember my grandma telling me stories about Robert. Now, he never made it home. From there, he went to the Philippines and was killed by a sniper. But his letters made it home. And Lori and I had the privilege to be part of that answered prayer in his letters, to go back many years later to those people groups in Papua New Guinea as a missionary. In fact, the people group that we worked among was called the Papatar. And when we moved in, they offered us a small piece of land, and they said the name of that piece of land was Cabahiro. And we didn't know Papatar at the time, the language, but we went ahead and moved in there, built our house, and began to learn their language. Well, a couple years later, we began to get stories from the people about what happened during World War II. Because during that time, the Japanese came into Papua New Guinea and set up camps and bases all over the country. And one of those locations was there among the Papatar people. And one of the stories that they told was this. Right in this area, one time, 2 American spies came in. That's what they called them. They said there was this American soldier, he was a black American, and an American soldier, he was a white American. And they were both from America. They were kind of surprised about that. And they came and they were sneaking in because they wanted to find the camps where the Japanese were to relay that information back to the Allies as to where the Japanese camps were located. So they came in and we were trying to do things to help them. And we've even heard a couple of stories as they describe these men that they had these special boots with the boot tread flipped around in reverse so that when they walked one way, it looked like they were walking the other way, so it was hard to track. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story they told. Now, as they told us, they said, unfortunately, they were captured by the Japanese. And they were put in these small bamboo cages and treated like pigs for the slaughter. The Papatar say, we don't know what happened to them. But that name of the land where they were captured and put in the cages was Cabahiro, which means place of tragedy. And that's where we got to locate and start telling about someone else that came to liberate and set free, not just from the physical world, but spiritually as well. A couple months after that incident, the Allies were able to come in and were able to, with the surrender of the Japanese, put them on barges and leave New Guinea, and the people had their freedom. I'd like to ask you another question. And this may be a little bit uncomfortable as well, but I'd like you to stand if this is true. We've been talking about the men and women who gave their lives for our country so that now we can have freedom, and we want to honor that. But can I ask you another question? Can I ask that those who remember the last time you have witnessed God working in or around you in some specific way, and you've told someone about that specific way, would you be willing to stand as well? If you can remember something that God's done recently in your life, and you've actually told somebody about that, would you be willing to stand? Thank you. You can be seated. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. From Joshua chapter 3 and 4, we're going to talk about Memorial Day. Now, this is a common passage. It's a familiar story. It's one that you may have even heard on a Memorial Day weekend service. I'm going to be reading from the NIV this morning, and the context of this is that the Israelites were taken from Egypt as slaves and brought into the wilderness. But instead of going directly into the promised land, because of their sin, because of not believing God, they wandered the wilderness for 40 years. And at this point in time, in Joshua 3, the Israelites are on the edge, right at the Jordan River, getting ready to cross over into this promised land that they had been given. And that's where we'll pick up the story in Joshua chapter 3, verse 9. It says this. Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan. While the water was flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completely crossed on dry ground. In this, our first point is the event. And this is what it says in that passage of Scripture. How does it start out? This is how you will know that the living God is among you. God said to Israel, I'm going to do something. And so Joshua said, come here, come here. Something's going to happen. God's going to do something. And it's going to be this. We're going to cross over the Jordan River with the help of God into this promised land. It's going to be a significant event. God is going to do something so that we will know He's the living God among us. Now, for Israel, this was a whole new chapter that they were going to go and be a part of in their national history. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard about the little boy who woke up one morning and went to the kitchen, and his mom was there, and he wanted some breakfast. So his mom said, okay, and she made him some toast with some peanut butter and honey on it, set it before him with a glass of milk, and said, there's your milk and your toast with peanut butter and honey. I'll be right back. And she walked out of the kitchen. A couple minutes later, she came back in, and the toast with the peanut butter and honey and the cup of milk hadn't been touched. But the little boy was sitting there finishing up the last few bites of a big piece of pie that had been left on the counter. And his mom was like, what in the world? What are you doing? That's not for breakfast. I made you toast with peanut butter and honey and this milk. Why are you eating that? The little boy said, well, last week in Sunday school, we were told that God made Israel go through the desserts first to get to the land of milk and honey. So that's what was happening. God was going to bring him out of not the desert, the wilderness, the place of wandering, into this land flowing with milk and honey, where there was produce and livestock and wild bees and everything there. Now, God had been feeding them with manna and quail for 40 years. That was going to end at this point in time. And they got to live off this land flowing with milk and honey. God had been leading them with the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night for 40 years. Now that was stopping. And the Ark of the Covenant is what was going to lead them. Moses was the one that had been leading them. Now he was had died, and Joshua was taking over. They were going from being a nation alone to now being a nation surrounded by other nations and people groups. Another thing I want us to note is in verse 11 is the first time that we see that phrase, Lord of all the earth. And then it's repeated again. Because God was the one who controlled the earth and everything in it. He's the sovereign Lord of the earth. And when he says, go to the Jordan, even though it's at flood stage, I'm going to help you across that. And just like I'm going to make the water stop flowing and go in the opposite direction and pile up, and I'm going to drive that water back, in the same way, as you go in, I'm going to drive those other 7 nations out, so that you can have the land that I made a covenant with you that I would give you. Because God is a sovereign God, and He has the power and the authority over people and nations and water and plants and food and everything in it. My grandpa Tony is here this morning, and when I was talking to him earlier in the week, I asked him if he was going to be here, and here was his reply. By the way, I love my grandpa's replies. If you've ever talked with him, his responses are great. Well, this was his reply about whether or not he'd be here. He said, "If the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise." So I love that response, but here's the reality. If the good Lord's willing, it really doesn't matter if the creek rises. Because as 2 million people got close to the Jordan River, probably end of April, early May, the first of their calendar year, it would have been at flood season, like Scripture says. At flood season, the snow on Mount Hermon melts, and they're just finishing up their rainy season. And it's when the banks just swell and can overflow. At this point in time, in the area where they crossed, it would have been 10 to 12 foot deep and 300 to 360 foot across. Now later in the story of Israel, when David is becoming king, it talks about his mighty men of valor, these men that could do incredible things. And in 1 Chronicles 12:15, one of the things that these mighty men, kind of like Navy SEALs, could do that was so impressive was that they could cross the Jordan during flood season. Now here's 2 million people, women, kids, animals. How are they going to do this Navy SEAL operation and get across the Jordan River? While we were living in Papua New Guinea in the village, one of the things I had the opportunity to do was go into different tribes where we had other church planting missionary teams to check on them and to visit them and spend time with them and to give them evaluations on how far they were getting in that specific language. And there was one where we had to leave our tribe from Papatar, get on a boat for about 3 hours, go across this big channel of the ocean, land there, and then get in a truck, an off-road vehicle, and drive about 2.5 hours to the end of the road. Literally, it just stopped. And then we'd have to get out from there and hike for about another 5 hours to get into the jungle where these missionaries were working with this people group. And I had done that a couple times. I had done it with my family. This time, I was going by myself. And I was going along. I had some of the local guys with me from that place. They met me in town, and we went out. And one of our first stops, about an hour into the hike, was a river that we had to cross. And as we had been traveling that morning, it was kind of stormy, and we had had a bit of rain. And when we started our hike, the rain got more and more intense. And when we got to this river, normally it was about 50 foot across and would come just above the knees. And on my previous trips, I remember having to really balance with the rocks down below, trying to get across, and at times would almost fall over from the rush of the stream when it was only at knee level. When we got there that day, it was about 3 times as wide. And one of the guys that went down in the bank to see, it was right at his eye level in depth. The rain was coming down, had my backpack on, and we just sat there at the side, waiting and waiting. We'd watch trees go by, debris go by. The water was muddy, things were rushing, it was really fast. There was no way to get across at that point. So we sat. Eventually the rain stopped, And noon became afternoon, and afternoon became evening, and we watched as the water subsided and slowed down. Got to a point where it was almost going to be dark, and it looked like another rainstorm was coming in. So we were either going to have to sleep on the ground in the rain by the river that night or try to cross. And so the guys decided it had gone down enough, slowed down enough, that they would help me and we get across. So hand in hand, one on each side, we jumped in. They took my backpack and we started across. And it must have been out in the middle about 5 foot because I could hit the ground and pop up and never completely submerged. But we were aiming, and by that time it was probably as wide as this auditorium. We were going to try to cut across and end up there. But with the flow, even at that rate, we got across way downriver. Because as we were going, we just kept getting pushed further and further. Now, we made it, but that was 5 foot deep. I don't know, 100 foot across. This would have been 2 to 3 times as deep. Over 300 foot across. Yet God is the Lord of the earth. And what he wants to do, he will accomplish. Now, the town of Adam, where he stopped the water, was somewhere around 18 to 25 miles upriver from the Jordan River, north. And God said, that's where you're stopping, right there near the town of Adam. And the water began to pile up there. That was the first miracle. Second miracle was this. As the water flowed down from Adam, where it had stopped, the water that was remaining in the banks flowed down to the Dead Sea. Not only did it flow down, but the riverbed was instantly dry. And so for that day, there would have been plenty of space, over 18 miles worth of space, for the people, 2 million people, to go across on dry land. The event is this. This is how you will know that the living God is among you. I'm going to take you into a new area, fulfill what I told you, and you're going to begin a new chapter of life. Let's keep going with the story. Joshua chapter 4, verse 1. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And they are there to this day. Now, a couple things about this. We talked about the event of what God was going to do. The second thing is the sign. There's a sign. It was not only an event, but there was a sign now. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. I want you to take these stones that are in the middle of the river, and they had to be pretty big because the 12 guys that did it, they put them on their shoulders and carried them up to the banks. And these stones are going to be a memorial. We have Memorial Day every year to remember the fallen for this country. And now there's a memorial of what God was going to do to take this nation into their land where they would have the promises that he was going to give them. Now, it's interesting to me that even before the crossing of the Jordan, in chapter 3, God had told Joshua to tell the Israelites to pick out 12 men, one from each tribe. But they didn't know why. So 12 men were chosen. And while the water was still flowing, I wonder what they were thinking. What are we going to have to do? But now that they crossed over, in chapter 4, the commands reiterate. Okay, pick those 12 men. Tell them to go get a stone. Take it up. Put it there. Piling up stones was actually a covenant ritual in the ancient Near East during this time. And if you think back to the concept of the altars, a lot of times altars were built to the Lord to remember a place or an event. So these stones, that would have been understood. Now, they weren't huge stones like Stonehenge or something, but in this area of the world, stone monuments would have been kind of a normal thing. So we have this sign. Let's move on to the final segment of the story. Joshua chapter 4. I'm going to skip down to verse 17 through 24. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that they might always fear the Lord, your God. We've talked about the event that God was going to do something for them. We talked about the sign that there would be stones to remember. And now the last point, I want us to think about the reason. The reason is this. He did this, verse 24, so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Why did he do it? So that all the earth would know about God. So now, thousands of years later, we're talking about this event. And that the people there would fear, honor the Lord. Remember what he had done for them. A memorial to the Lord. Now it's interesting in verse 19 that this took place on the 10th day of the first month. Any significance with that? 10th day of the first month. If you look at that day in other places in Scripture, that was in preparation for the Passover. That was the day, actually, 40 years earlier, that God had told the Israelites, prepare today because I'm taking you out of Egypt. Now, 40 years later to the day, prepare because I'm taking you into the promised land. They went over on the day that they were supposed to be preparing for this Passover. A second time that God was bringing them in to a new chapter of their national history. Another interesting note to me is this. Verse 21. Who is it that's supposed to be telling the people about the stones? In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, What do these stones mean? Tell them. Israel crossed over on dry land. The parents were going to be telling their kids, who would be telling their kids, who would be telling their kids. And parents, that's our responsibility, to tell what God has done. We don't leave that to the schools, to the Sunday school teacher, to pastor. It's our responsibility to tell our children what God has done. Now, I think God was wanting to do this as they entered this promised land because he knew that in the immediate future, he was going to drive out those 7 nations, and they were going to have this land with gardens that were already planted, with food already to be harvested, with towns that were already built, and they were going to have a blessed life. Things were going to be good. And what happens in our lives when things are good? A lot of times, we forget God. But I want you to remember what happened to get you to this point. But then you know what happened after that? Israel forgot about God, and they wandered away, and judgment came. And what happens in our lives when bad things happen? We can turn to God, or sometimes we doubt God. Why are you allowing this? Remember the stones? Remember what I did for you? Remember the covenant and how I was going to bless you if you did this? Memorial Day. Remember what I did for you? In closing, I want us to think through 3 applications that we can do for our lives. First one is this: recognize when God is working, answering prayer, or providing. I was encouraged to see so many of you stand up, that you've recognized something God's done. That should be all of us, though. Do you even see what God is doing in your life? Do you see how he's moving waters, mountains, and people, and situations, and circumstances for the next chapter of your life? Are you praying to him in belief that he can answer prayers, that he is the Lord of the earth? Have you noticed how he has been providing for you financially, spiritually, physically? And if not, I would recommend there might be 3, or I'd suggest there might be 3 reasons if you're not recognizing that God is working. One is you might just have your eyes closed to it. Because I imagine in the crowd of 2 million people, there were people that were just oblivious to what was going on. They were just in the pack, going forward with everybody else, across the river, not even aware of the significance of what was happening that day. That might be us. God's doing things, we're just got our eyes closed to it. Second possibility is this: with 2 million people, there would have been some on the very outskirts that probably never heard the words of Joshua, that didn't get the message relayed, that crossed somewhere else and kind of just was unaware because they were outside the camp, in a sense. And I wonder in our lives, if we're just so far away from what is going on, we're not in the Word, we're not focused, and we're missing it. A third possibility is this: the other nations, the people that weren't Israelites, they were way inland. They didn't see any of this. And if we're not seeing stuff that God is doing, there's a possibility that we're not even in God's family. And he wants to work in our lives. And if you're here this morning and you're not part of God's family, he makes it available through Jesus Christ. Recognizing that we are sinners separated from God, that we can't do anything to restore that relationship in our own strength. But Jesus came, lived a perfect life, and died for us, so that by trusting in his work for us, we can be part of his family. And he can begin working in and through us in amazing ways. First application is this: recognize when God is working, answering prayer, providing. Second application is this: reflect on what God has done by writing it down and symbolizing it. There are lots of memorials now for Memorial Day. One of the most famous is the first tomb of the unknown soldier. It was dedicated in 1866. It has guards guarding it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The grave of the unknown soldier. The first one was built, contains the remains of 2,111 soldiers from the Civil War. A memorial. You can go and look at it. That's for those soldiers who fell during the Civil War that we don't even know their names and where they're from. That's a symbol of something. What symbol do we have of what God's doing? The Israelites, they had stones. This morning, I went outside. I don't know what the story is on all these painted rocks that are around. Sunday school? Okay, this could be a type of symbol. When I was in college, somebody shared this story with us and challenged us to have some sort of symbol to remind us of what God had done. So in my dorm room, we actually decided, we had this big bulletin board, we're going to get brown construction paper, cut them out to look like stones or rocks, and write prayer requests on them. So that's what we did for the whole semester. We wrote down prayer requests on these pieces of construction paper that look like rocks. And we put them there in one corner of the bulletin board. And then, as we prayed through those things and we saw God answer them, we'd move it to the pile on the other side of the bulletin board. And we began to stack those up. And by the end of the semester, man, there's a whole bulletin board side of stones. Do we recognize what he's doing? And are we writing it down or symbolizing it in some way? Dallas Salzma. Many of you know she got to come over. She was my teacher in 5th grade, and then again in high school she tried to teach me accounting. That didn't go so well for me, but she had a passion for education and for missions. And she came over to New Guinea 2016. And then with her passing, PJ and the team that went through the house, they found this journal from that time in New Guinea. I just want to read a couple parts. This was from February. She writes, I worked in the library and then went to the store. As I came up the sidewalk to the road from the store, there was Lori Luse. I stopped, put down my groceries, and we hugged. Talked a little bit and hugged again. That was the first time that Lori got to see her on that trip. She writes more about that day. The next day, Tuesday. The rest of school went as usual. After work detail, I stopped by Lori's house and visited a while. Had my second cup of coffee and P&G. Big exclamation point. We visited until Aaron called. I left and came home. She writes about the rest of the evening and then says, I got to bed later than usual and had a hard time going to sleep. Big praise, though. All in capital letters. My leg did not hurt or ache all day without Tylenol. Exclamation point. Not huge. She got to hug Lori. She got her second cup of coffee. Her leg didn't hurt all day without Tylenol. But for her, God was working. They were rocks. Because she wrote it down. What are we doing? Are you writing stuff down? Are you symbolizing it? In Papatar, one of the customs when they visit other villages or locations, as they return back home, they're always given a parting gift. And the gift is some food to last the next day or two from their gardens, and a plant or a tree or a seed that they can take back and plant it in their garden or in their house or near their house. So now we have Papatar people in our church that have gone throughout other villages and spent time with people, both unbelievers and Christians, and encouraging them. And now they take this food back with them in these plants and trees, and they plant them around their house and in their garden. And I've had the opportunity to sit with some of the Papatar people who say, see that bush over there? The one with the yellow flowers? That was from the lady that was sick in that other village, and we went and prayed for her. And she's better now. See that tree that's growing? It's only like shoulder high now, but it's going to get really big. That's from the guy in this village that asked us to come and spend time, and he wants to know the story of Jesus and wants us to go teach him. You see that little plant there? That's from that person we prayed for, and they didn't want to hear the truth about the Bible. But then they did, and they got saved, and then they died. But we know where they're at, and that plant is what God did. What about us? Are we reflecting on what God is doing by writing it down and symbolizing it in some way? What can you do? Third thing is this. Retell what God has done to others and to yourself. Because the people of Israel weren't just supposed to put the stones there and remember themselves. They were to do it to tell their children and their children's children. To tell what God, so that why the whole earth would know about the power of God and they would fear him. You know what one of the advantages of coming back to America and being able to speak in churches is? Of the opportunity I had to write that book, Tales from the Tribe, about all the stories from Papatar. We're talking with others like we did in Sunday school this morning about things in Papua New Guinea. The advantage of that is that we are forced to tell people what God has done. That's not a bad idea. Maybe we should just start forcing everybody to come up here and tell what God has done. Because when we do that, it sticks in our brains better. We relay to others how great our God is. So I want to close with this. We have to tell others what God has done in our lives. Who have you told? What memorials do you have that we can say, remember when? This is an awesome weekend to start that. Because we can reflect on the people who sacrificed their lives so that we could be in this country. And we can reflect on a God who sent his son to give his life so that we could have a relationship with him. And it's not a stalemate relationship. He is continuing to do stuff in our lives. Are we seeing it? Are we reflecting on it? And are we retelling it? Father, thank you for this time. Thank you that you're the God who moves waters. You're the God who provides. You're the God who wants to be in a relationship with us and express your mighty power. You're a God who answers prayer. You're a God who changes hearts. And oftentimes, I think we miss it. We thank you for the sacrifice of so many men and women that have given their lives for our freedom in this country, and we remember and honor them. But even more importantly, we thank you that you made a way for us to be rescued spiritually and have a relationship with you. And you continue to work. So help us to remember that. Reflect on it and tell others about it. And it's in the name of the Lord of the earth we pray these things. Amen.